Okay, so today we are beginning the study of the Book of Esther. If you have your Bible, open it up to the Book of Esther. Hopefully you picked up the outline when you came in. Every time we start a new book of the Bible, I email it to you on Tuesday morning, and then it's printed here. You can either print it at home or you can pick one up when you get here. I'm not going to read through that, but I'm going to go through many of the things that are in it. Just a short overview of the book is that Esther is a Jewish orphan living in Persia. She's been adopted and raised by her older cousin Mordecai. Now let me explain why these Jews are living in Persia. What we saw happen last semester is that God's people in the Promised Land had fallen into captivity. First, they had a civil war, and the northern 10 tribes became their own nation called Israel. The southern 2 tribes, were called Judah, and they were their own country. Both countries got off track, but the northern kingdom a little quicker, and so they fell into captivity in 722 BC to the Assyrians. The southern kingdom lasted a little longer. And by lasting longer, I mean they had a few good kings and they had some revivals and some times when they did turn to God. Whereas the northern kingdoms, they started serving pagan gods and they didn't stray from it. And so God, as He had promised back in the Torah, had said, you know, there will come a time that you're going to stop obeying me and start worshiping other gods. And when that happens, you know, He gives them a period of grace, an opportunity to turn and change, but they didn't. And so the northern kingdom goes to the Assyrians. Then the Babylonians conquer the Assyrians, and they come after Judah, the southern kingdom, and some other countries. And so what we saw in the end in Ezra and Nehemiah were that they were taken captive. They at the end of 2 Chronicles describes that. And so they were taken to Babylon. But then Babylon didn't last much longer either. And the Medo-Persian Empire comes in and conquers, in 539 BC, conquers the Babylonians. And they take the country to an even larger size and more powerful. So anyway, that's why these Jews are living in Persia. Now, many have gone back, but the majority have not. During Ezra and Nehemiah, we saw 3 different groups of Jews who went back under Cyrus, under Darius, went back to the Promised Land, but not everybody chose to. And so this group that we're reading about in the book of Esther, they were born in captivity. They were born in Persia. They have never been to the Promised Land. And so it gives us a picture of what's taking place there. This is one of the most fascinating books in the Bible. It contains history. It contains romance, intrigue, adventure, deceit, courage, wisdom, deliverance, and a big reversal of fortune. But perhaps more than any other book, it demonstrates the providence of God. Although we may not today understand everything that's happening around us, we must trust in God's protection and retain our integrity by doing what we know to be right. And no matter how hopeless our condition, we need not despair because God is in control. So let's look at the who, what, when, where, why before we jump right into the text. Who? This book has several major characters. Esther, King of Ahasuerus, who's also known as Xerxes, Mordecai, Haman. These are the main guys. Esther's mentioned 55 times. King Ahasuerus is mentioned 165 times. Okay, that's a lot. So you would look at it and say, well, maybe he's the main character instead of Esther, but she's definitely the star of this book. Haman's mentioned 53, Mordecai 59 times. But the amazing thing about this book is that God is not mentioned. His name does not appear in any form, not even one time. Faith is not mentioned. Prayer is not mentioned. The temple's not mentioned. Religion is not mentioned. But yet, through it all, although his name is not there, his fingerprints are all over this story, all over this book, and we will see that as we look through it. What kind of book is this? It's a book of the history of the Jews who remained in Persia instead of returning to Israel. And in the Catholic and Protestant Bibles, it's the last of the section of books that we refer to as history, because it takes us past the exile and into that last period of historical books. After this, we go into the books of wisdom and poetry, Job, Psalms, Proverbs, those books, okay? So it's the last historical book. When did it take place? Approximately 483 to 473 BC. Chronologically, it falls between chapters 6 and 7 of Ezra. Now, that book is divided in two, and in Ezra, the first 6 chapters have to do with Zerubbabel bringing back the first group of Jewish refugees back to the Promised Land. Then there's a break of 58 years, and then Ezra brings back a group of people. So in that 58-year break, kind of towards the end of that, that's when the Book of Esther takes place. And so she would have also been around still when Ezra and Nehemiah were living, it's thought. Okay, so where does it take place? In Susa, the capital of Persia. Why was it written? To give the history of the Feast of Purim. The Feast of Purim is a big deal to the Jewish people still today, because it commemorates this time in their history when their race was almost annihilated, and yet this woman stands up and speaks up and takes a stand, and they are saved. The book of Esther is considered controversial for 3 reasons. Among Christians. Never among Jews was it ever doubted that it would be in their canon of Scripture. But to some Christians, because it doesn't mention the name of God, and because it's the only book of the Old Testament that doesn't show up in the Dead Sea Scrolls that were found, and the New Testament makes no mention of it, no quote of it, no allusion, no reference to it. Some Christians, like Martin Luther, had said it has no place in the Bible. But the overwhelming majority of scholars and those who have met had said, yes, it absolutely should be in the canon of Scripture, and it is. And thank goodness it is, because it's a mighty and powerful book. Okay, chapter 1 of Esther. Now in the days of Ahasuerus, and like I said, he's called Xerxes. Ahasuerus is his Hebrew name. Xerxes is his Greek name. And throughout history, that's who he's known as, is Xerxes. And so I may just switch to that because it's easier to say. But the Ahasuerus, and the NIV and some other translations have Xerxes rather than Ahasuerus. So anyway. The Ahasuerus, who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. In those days, when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa, the citadel, the capital, in the 3rd year of his reign, so he began reigning in 486 BC, now it's 483 BC, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants, the army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and the governors of the provinces were before him. And while he showed the riches of his glory and the splendor and the pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. So let's have the map up here. A 6-week feast with all his military and all his leaders. Now, this map, the gray shows the Persian kingdom at that time. And in the very center of it, right here in almost the center, is Susa. They have moved the capital from Babylon to Susa as the capital of the Medo-Persian Empire. And that's about 200 miles west of Babylon, to give you perspective. So their territory goes all the way over here, taking up part of India, over through all of the Middle East, down to Egypt, up through what would have been the promised land of Israel, up through Turkey, and a little ways over into Greece today, Macedonia, as it was called, that section of it back then. Now, the book of Esther records events during the reign of this king, Xerxes, who is really a famous person in Greek history in particular, but really in all history. He is known as Xerxes the Great, king of Persia. There are many artifacts that have his picture. You could go ahead to the next picture. Artifacts that they found that represent him. Go ahead to the next one. That show him sitting on the throne. He is a famous figure. There have been many books written about him. And so we can learn, when you take archaeology and history and put it with the Bible, we see that there's really not a conflict there, but that it each tells us more. History learns more about what happened from the Bible, and the Bible learns a little more what happened from looking at history. So it's okay, people. It's okay to know history, all right? It's a good thing to know history. So Xerxes was the grandson of Cyrus the Great. Cyrus the Great, we saw at the very end of 2nd Chronicles and the very beginning of Ezra, it says that he sent out a decree saying that any of the Jews who wanted to go back to the Promised Land could. So he was a big deal. He was the first of the Persian kings. He started what was the Achaemenid dynasty. And so that was Xerxes' grandfather on his mother's side. His father was Darius the Great. We've read about him in the Bible also. And Darius had been king for several years, and he is the one who in history went to attack the Greeks, because they wanted Greece to be part of the Persian Empire. They were snagging up everybody else. Let's go for Greece. But they were defeated at Marathon. And if you're a runner who likes to do long distance, you are familiar with the battle that took place at Marathon. There was a Greek messenger, and the legend says that he was sent from the battlefield of Marathon to Athens to let them know that the Persians had been defeated. And guess how far that was? Just a little over 26 miles. So that's where we got the name for Marathon. All right. Then in 486, Darius was fighting again another battle, and because the Egyptians had rebelled against him. And so in that battle, Darius died, which means Xerxes became king. And as he became king, he reconquered, right off the bat, he had a victory. He reconquered the Egyptians, and he wanted to go and take another shot at the Greeks, but he knew he needed some time and some preparation. He wanted to avenge the death of his father and make his mission successful of taking Greece, but he knew it would take some time. So what biblical authorities think is that this 6-month-long feast was part of a war council. He's bringing in all his major military guys. Look how great we are. Look how great I am. Look how powerful we are. Look how rich we are. Let's plan it. Let's go get the Greeks. So it's thought that that was why this was going on at this time in history. Verse 5. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa, the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace. So the 6-month party is followed by a party for everybody, not just the leaders, everybody, big 7-day party. Verse 6. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. So, can you imagine? Everybody's drinking out of these golden vessels, these golden goblets, and no two are alike. I mean, we think everything has to be all matchy-matchy, don't we, if we're setting the table? We want the dishes maybe to match and the glasses to not everybody. But no, in that day, it was a big deal if there were no two alike. So that just showed the lavishness and the extent of what this king has. Verse 8, and drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. That means you could have as much as you wanted or none, as little as you wanted. You didn't have to drink, but if you wanted to drink, you could just keep drinking as long as you wanted to. For the king had given orders to all the staff to his palace to do as each man desired. Okay, so we have this lavish party, and then in verse 9, we see Queen Vashti, the wife of King Ahasuerus. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the seventh day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded these 7 guys, led by Memucan, these 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of the king, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command delivered by the eunuchs. At this, the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. We're going to see that he has a bit of an anger management issue. Maybe that should have been his word for the year. I'm just saying. It says, then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure towards all those versed in law and judgment. And so he brings in a team of people. They see the king's face, and he asks them, according to the law, what is to be done with Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of a King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. And so they're going to decide what's to happen to her fate. Now, why didn't she do this? Okay, how many of you would want to go in and be the only woman in a banquet in front of hundreds, maybe thousands of men who had had too much to drink? Anybody? Anybody going to volunteer for that? Okay, and there could be more to the story, because at this time, it is thought this is about the time that she was pregnant with Artaxerxes, the king that we read about in the book of Nehemiah, okay? And so this would have been about the time she was pregnant, so, that just makes it a little bit more to it. Now, for the non-VeggieTales version of the story, there are those scholars who say when he commanded her to come in with her crown on, that's all he wanted her wearing, was the crown. And so that would have been, no way am I doing that. So she did not go in there. We don't know what the real version is. I have a feeling that she just was like, I'm not going, period. Clothes on or clothes off. It's not happening. But then this council comes together, verse 17, for the queen's behavior will be, they're saying the queen's behavior is going to be known to all the women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, and she did not come. This very day, the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard the queen's behavior will say the same thing to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, his advisors say, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed. And we're going to see several decrees go out from this king. And the way things happened at that time, the king would sign it, seal it with his ring, and it could not be revoked. So they're saying, hey, let it be written, let it be signed that she is never again to come before King Ahasuerus. And let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike. This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man must be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Okay, so a pretty severe decree is made here, suggested by his officials. The king jumps on this. He thinks that's a great idea. Now, she was not killed. She was not executed. She was just no longer queen. She was moved out of the royal palace. And, you know, like I say, it's thought that this is when she was pregnant. So he's going to make sure that she's taken care of. But she's not queen. She has no authority. And they are making an example of her. We're going to see that this king often made rash decisions, and the Greek historian Herodotus wrote many books of Greek history, and he writes about Xerxes in his epic writing called The Persian Wars, and in it he talks about his temper. And there's even a plaque that has been found, and we've got a picture of it, that is a plaque inscripted, and it's at Persepolis, which is east of Susa, but it was also like a capital in Persia. And it's by him, and it says this: I am not hot-tempered. Whatever befalls me in battle, I hold firmly. I am ruling firmly from my own will, on my own will. The man who is cooperative according to his cooperation, thus I reward him. And to him who does harm, I treat him according to the harm I will punish. And so, you know, it's like he had such notoriety as a hothead that he had to put out a press statement here going, I'm not a hothead. No, I'm not a hothead. Okay, but was he? All right. Well, history shows us a few more things. Between chapter 1 and chapter 2, there's a period of 4 years, or at least 3 years, because chapter 1, it's the 3rd year of his reign. When we get into chapter 2, on down where Esther is taken into the kingdom, or not into the kingdom, into the palace, it's year 7. So what happened during those 4 years? Well, Vashti's out, and the war council has made some decisions, and they are going for Greece. So history tells us that at this point, the Persians go against the Greeks, and the Greeks come up with an army. Greece was not a nation then. It was all these city-states. And so Sparta gets 300, and how many of you have seen the movie 300? That's what it's about, is Xerxes. There's a couple of movies called 300. The 300 Spartans come to fight to get ready for these Persians who are coming. They get a few other guys from city-states. It's thought maybe 7,000 others. But here comes Xerxes with the largest assembled army that had ever been taken. They claimed it was a million. It's thought really it was more like 200,000 to 400,000. But that was still huge for those days. And here they come, and they have this famous battle in world history at Thermopylae. And the 300 hold off this huge army for 3 days. And then they fall. They're defeated, but they have become heroes. It's like you stood up to that army for 3 days. I mean, those guys are, almost considered immortal to this day, the 300 Spartans, and that's why movies have been made about them. From there, the Persians are a little distraught because they didn't do as well as they thought they would, and it took a little longer, but they've also got these ships. They've got over 1,200 ships, and they go into this bay to fight the Greek ships. The Greek ships are 371. They're smaller ships, and they can maneuver. The Greek ships are huge, and they can't move very quickly. And they are defeated. The Persians are defeated, and Xerxes is furious with his military, the army and the navy. And he goes back home, and it's like, we've got to regroup. And he's not in a good mood. He gets back home, and of course, he doesn't have Vashti as queen anymore. Chapter 2. Verse 1, after these things, when the anger of King Ahasuerus, and remember that's Xerxes, Ahasuerus, same person, after the anger had abated, he remembered Vashti, and that word remember has not just memory but emotion, like love involved with it. He remembered Vashti and what she had done and what had been decreed against her. Then the king's young men who attended him said, let beautiful young virgins be sought out for the king, and let the king appoint officers in all the provinces of his kingdom to gather all the beautiful young virgins to the harem in Susa the citadel, under the custody of Haggai, the king's eunuch, who is in charge of the women. Let their cosmetics be given to them, and let the young woman who pleases the king be queen instead of Vashti. This pleased the king, and he did so. So again, Pony Express sends out this decree to all of Persia, all these 127 provinces, send us your young, beautiful virgins so the king can, pick a queen. So this is the first Miss Universe contest. And so they are all being brought in to see who the king likes. Then we get a little more information for the first time on the Jews in this story. Now there was a Jew in Susa, the citadel, whose name was Mordecai, the son of Jair, the son of Shemaiah, son of Kish, a Benjaminite. So he's a Jew, but he's from the tribe of Benjamin. Who had been carried away from Jerusalem among the captives, not him, but probably Kish, his grandfather, was the one who was brought in. Mordecai, at this point, Judah's been long gone, so he was born in Persia, but he's a Jew. His ancestors had been carried away by Jeconiah, king of Judah, whom Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, had carried away. So Mordecai was bringing up Hadassah, that's her Hebrew name, that is Esther, the daughter of his uncle, for she had neither father nor mother. The young woman had a beautiful figure and was lovely to look at, and when her father and mother died, Mordecai took her as his own daughter. Now Mordecai, that name is very similar to the name Marduk, which was a Babylonian god, if we could have that, yeah. And there are names in history that they have found of a Jewish aide named Mardukah. What we have seen, like in other places in the Bible, Daniel, the Babylonians would take the Jews and change their names, and that was common. In fact, it was common when you conquered a land, you didn't just leave them there, the people there, because then they would rise up, they would multiply, rise up, and overthrow your government. But what you would do, and that's what the Babylonians did, the Assyrians did, the Persians did, conquer the people, bring the best of them, and the most of them, and disperse them throughout the empire so that they assimilate into your own society and pick up your own ways and your cultures and your religions so that they forget about their nation and their culture and their family. So that was kind of what had taken place here. So his name was changed probably to Mordecai. Although now it is a popular Jewish name. Hadassah was a Hebrew name meaning myrtle, and it was changed, that's a tree. And then Esther is a Persian name meaning star. It's perhaps from the name Ishtar, which was a Babylonian goddess of love. We don't know, but it's Ishtar. It means star. Some would say it means hidden, but more authorities would say it means star. Verse 8. So when the king's order and his edict were proclaimed, and when many young women were gathered in Susa, the citadel, in custody of Haggai, Esther was also taken into the king's palace and put in custody of Haggai, who had charge of the women. So Haggai is the eunuch. Haggai is the head guy. Verse 9. And the young woman pleased him, Esther, and won his favor. And he quickly provided her with her cosmetics and her portion of food, and with 7 chosen young women from the king's palace, and advanced her and her young women to the best place in the harem. So they gathered these young women. They're put in this virgin harem. And Esther is taken. She's beautiful. She's taken. And right away she finds favor with Haggai. So we're already seeing the providence of God at work here as she is chosen, number one. She's found favor with the head guy. She's in the best place. And verse 10 tells us, Esther had not made known her people or her kindred, for Mordecai had commanded her not to make it known. In other words, nobody knew she was Jewish. They're all Middle Eastern, had similar looks. And so he's just like, this is the time to be silent. And what we're going to see in Esther's life is there's definitely a time for her to be silent, and there's a time for her to speak up. So this is the time for her to be silent. So she doesn't tell people that she's Jewish. Verse 11. And every day Mordecai walked in front of the court of the harem to learn how Esther was and what was happening to her. So he cares for her. He's like her dad, and he's checking on her daily just to make sure everything is okay with her. Let's see. Where was I? Okay. Verse 12. Now, when the turn came for each young woman to go into King Ahasuerus, after being 12 months under the regulation for the women, since this was the regular period of their beautifying, 6 months with oil and myrrh, and 6 months with spices and ointments. Okay, ladies. A 12-month spa trip. Are you listening to this? Guys who are watching online, cosmetics and spas are biblical. Okay? I mean, can you imagine this? So each woman is receiving this. 12 months of beautifying and spices and ointments, and they were probably being trained in some other ways, learning some of the protocol that would be necessary if you were to meet with the king or become queen, or how to handle yourself, okay? Wow. Verse 13. When the young woman went into the king, and this would be any young woman, she was given whatever she desired to take with her from the harem to the king's palace. In the evening she would go in, and in the morning she would return to the second harem, in custody of Shashgaz, the king's eunuch who was in charge of the concubines. She would not go to the king again unless the king delighted in her and she was summoned by name. So, okay, 12 months of beauty treatments, and then, Linda gets called up. Okay, it's your night with the king. Again, this is not the VeggieTales version that we study here today. She would have gone in, she would have slept with the king. She would have chosen some little piece of jewelry or something to take with her, just that little extra pizzazz. But she would have gone in, spent the night with him, and since she slept with the king, she can no longer go back to the harem of the virgins. She goes to the second harem of the concubines. So now she is the king's concubine, which means anytime he wants to sleep with her or spend time with her, same thing, he can call her by name and she'll come. Now, what this also means for these young ladies is they could not marry. They could not leave the palace. They would be in that particular part of the palace complex. It was for the concubines. But that is their life. They're not going to have a normal family life from here on out. Okay? So that's how it was. How would they have looked after it? Let's see a picture of what they would have looked. Okay. They went in looking like nothing, and they probably came out there to see the king looking like a pretty woman. All right? Think of Julia Roberts, beautiful with no makeup, but boy, you put makeup on her and, you know. So these women were already pretty. They became even more beautiful. But he's still going through the process. He hasn't found one yet until we get to verse 15. When the term came for Esther, the daughter of Abihail, the uncle of Mordecai, who had taken her as his own daughter to go into the king, she asked for nothing except what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who had charge of the women, advised. He's like, okay, now what are you going to choose to wear or take in there with you? And she's like, well, you pick. Why don't you select for me? And he does. And it says, now Esther was winning favor in the eyes of all who saw her. And when Esther was taken to King Ahasuerus into his royal palace in the 10th month, which is the month of Tebet, in the 7th year, so 4 years since Vashti was moved out, the king loved Esther more than all the women, and she won grace and favor in his sight more than all the virgins, so that he set the royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. So not only was he pleased with her, but it was like love at first sight. He truly loves Esther. And so it was like, really, once she showed up, it was no contest. She was Miss Persia. Got it. So then the king, verse 18, gave a great feast for all his officials and servants. It was Esther's feast. He also wanted a remission of taxes to the provinces and gave gifts with royal generosity. Okay, so he's so happy he's found her. He's throwing a big wedding feast, inviting everybody, and he goes, and by the way, I'm cutting your taxes and I'm sending you a rebate in the mail. So he's in a good mood, right? He's no longer angry. He is a happy camper. And here they would have been a beautiful couple. He was about 40, in his early 40s at this time. Yeah. She would have been, we don't know what age, but probably still a teenager. Let's go to the next picture. They're a beautiful couple. And just in preparation for this, I watched about 3 Esther movies this past weekend, because I wanted to see, do I want to teach from One Night with the King or Esther or For Such a Time as This, or do I want to use the ESV Bible? I decided on the Bible, you'll be glad to know, because all 3 of the movies that I watched had a lot of stuff that just wasn't quite right. But if you're going to watch just one, I would suggest One Night with the King. It's a good story, and the acting's a little better in that one. But anyway, she's queen. Verse 19. Now, when the virgins were gathered together the second time, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Esther had still not made known her kindred or her people, as Mordecai had commanded her, for Esther obeyed Mordecai just as when she was brought up by him. In those days, Mordecai was sitting at the king's gate. Bigthan and Teresh, two of the king's eunuchs who guarded the threshold, became angry and sought to lay hands on King Ahasuerus. And this came to the knowledge of Mordecai, and he told Queen Esther. And Esther told the king in the name of Mordecai. And when the affair was investigated and found to be so, the men were both hanged on gallows. And it was recorded in the book of the Chronicles in the presence of the king. So Mordecai overhears a couple of the king guys plotting to kill the king. He tells Esther. Esther reports it to the king. It's written down, but the king doesn't really do anything about it. That's just information to save for later, okay? So put that in your brain that this happened. Chapter 3. After these things, and this takes place, we're going to see further down, this is 5 years later, okay? She's been queen for 5 years, okay? After these things, King Ahasuerus promoted Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, and advanced him and set his throne above all the officials who were with him. Okay, so it brings a new character into the story at this point, and he's the bad guy, okay? And it tells us right off that he is an Agagite. What is an Agagite? Well, if you go back to 1 Samuel, King Agag is mentioned there. And he is the king of the Amalekites. And King Saul, the first king of Israel, is in a battle, and Samuel the prophet tells King Saul, go and kill all of the Amalekites. Wipe them out. Whoa, why? They've been enemies since Israel came out of out of Egypt, going to the promised land. Their first battle, Exodus 17, tells us that when Moses had the rod up and his hands were up, they were winning the battle. But when his arms went down, the Amalekites were winning. And so Hur and Jethro held his arms up, and Moses and the Israelites won. That was the Amalekites. First battle off. So they were enemies. But that enemy line goes back even further, because Amalek, the start of the Amalekites, was the grandson of Esau. Okay? Remember the twins that were born to Rebekah? Jacob and Esau. When did they start fighting? In their mother's womb, the Bible tells us. So Esau has this son, Amalek, has descendants Agag. Saul is supposed to wipe them out completely, even their livestock, everybody, and he doesn't. And Saul, who was a Benjaminite, okay, like Mordecai is from that same line. So there's family history. There's family history here. The Agagites and the Benjaminites are enemies, but more than that, the Jews are enemies with these because they are Amalekites, and they go back to Esau, like I said. His people traditionally became known as the Edomites, and so from the Edomites you had several different tribes that are enemies. But it's like if I say I'm from Houston, it goes without saying I'm also a Texan. And if I'm also a Texan, it goes without saying I'm also an American. So if you're an Agagite, you're also an Amalekite, you're also an Edomite, and these two are enemies throughout the Bible. We get to the New Testament, and that continues with King Herod the Great, who is half Jew, half Edomite, okay? Really more Edomite. Okay, so that's the family history. Did everybody get that? Thank you. I thought you were going to say, can you tell me that again? Okay, so here's Haman, the Agagite. He's been promoted to a high position in Persia, second only to the king. Verse 2. All the king's servants who were at the king's gate bowed down and paid homage to Haman, for the king had so commanded concerning him, but Mordecai, this Benjaminite, this Jew, is not going to do it. He did not bow down or pay homage. Verse 3, when the king's servants who were at the king's gate said to Mordecai, why do you transgress the king's command? And when they spoke to him day after day, he would not listen to them, and they told Haman in order to see whether Mordecai's words would stand, for he had told them that he was a Jew. And when Haman saw that Mordecai did not bow or pay homage to him, Haman was filled with fury, and he disdained to lay hands on Mordecai alone. So, as they had made known to him the people of Mordecai, Haman sought to destroy all the Jews, the people of Mordecai, throughout the whole kingdom of Ahasuerus. And so what happens in this next part is he goes and he gets some pur, P-U-R. That's like dice, like lot. P-U-R-I-M is plural. In the Hebrew, if you see an I-M on it, like seraphim, that's plural. So he gets the dice, basically. He rolls them to see what day he's going to ask the king to have all these Jews annihilated. And then he goes into the king and he says that there's a people who lives among us, and they're not like everybody else. They follow their own rules and laws. And truly they did, because God had set them apart to be different. And so he said, they're doing their own things, and they're not really keeping your commands. In other words, there's one of them who won't bow to me. So let's wipe them out. And he doesn't tell them that they're Jews. He doesn't say anything about it. He just says, I'll give you 10,000 talents of silver to have these people wiped out, and I'll handle it. So the king gives him his signet ring. He's like, okay, here, take my ring. Write out whatever you want to say in this decree, and then put my seal on it. And so it's done, and these letters are sent out all over the kingdom in every language. Pony Express, man, they were busy in these days, taking all of this out to the different parts of the country with this. And it says in verse 15 of chapter 3, the couriers went out hurriedly by order of the king, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was thrown into confusion. The people didn't get it, not just the Jews, the other people. They had been living just fine together, very peacefully, working together, living in the same cities and towns. And they're like, well, what happened here? What is this about? They're confused. Chapter 4. When Mordecai learned all that had been done, Mordecai tore his clothes and put on sackcloth and ashes, a sign of mourning, and went into the midst of the city, and he cried out with a loud and bitter cry. He went up to the entrance of the king's gate, for no one was allowed to enter the king's gate clothed in sackcloth. And in every province, wherever the king's command and decree reached, there was great mourning among the Jews, with fasting and weeping and lamenting, and many of them lay in sackcloth and ashes. Okay, it doesn't mention that they're praying, but fasting and prayer go together in Israelites' history and in biblical history, Old and New Testament together. So it says that in verse 4, when Esther's young women and her eunuchs came and told her, the queen was deeply distressed. They told her that people were out there crying, and that Mordecai, her cousin, was one of them. She sent clothes to clothe Mordecai so that he might take off his sackcloth, but he would not accept them. Then Esther called for Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs who had been appointed to attend her, and ordered him to go to Mordecai to learn what this was and why it was. Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city in front of the king's gate. And Mordecai told him all that had happened to him and the exact sum of money that Haman had promised to pay the king's treasurers for the destruction of the Jews. Mordecai also gave him a copy of the written decree issued in Susa for their destruction, that he might show it to Esther and explain it to her, and command her to go to the king to beg his favor and plead with him on behalf of her people. And Hathach went out and told Esther what Mordecai had said. Then Esther spoke to Hathach and commanded him to go to Mordecai and say, all the king's servants and the people of the king's provinces know that if any man or woman goes to the king inside the inner court without being called, there is but one law, to be put to death, except to the one whom the king holds out the golden scepter so that he may live. But as for me, I have not been called to come in to the king these 30 days. So there's a little trouble in paradise right there. She's not spent any time with the king in a month. And Mordecai's saying, hey, you've got to go talk to the king. You've got to beg him for our lives. She sees it and she's like, I'm not in favor with him apparently right now. He doesn't want to see me. If I go in there, the law is he can have me killed. The exception is if he wants to spare me, he'll hold out his scepter. And they told Mordecai what Esther said. And Mordecai told them to reply to Esther. Verse 13. Do not think to yourself that in the king's palace you will escape any more than all the other Jews. And then here's verse 14. This is the key verse of the whole book. So go ahead, outline it, underline it, put a star in not if you're using a Pew Bible. But mark this key verse. For if you keep silent at this time, relief and deliverance will rise for the Jews from another place. But you and your father's house will perish. And who knows whether you have not come to the kingdom for such a time as this. So he's saying, yeah, you're taking a chance, but if you do nothing, you're going to die. You're definitely going to die if you do nothing. Not only will you die, but all your family is going to die if you do nothing. So who knows if God didn't put you in this place for such a time as this. Where has God put you at this particular point in history? Just put that in the back of your mind. Verse 15. Then Esther told them to reply to Mordecai, go, gather all the Jews to be found in Susa and hold a fast on my behalf and do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my young women will also fast as you do. Then I will go to the king, though it is against the law, and if I perish, I perish. Mordecai then went away and did everything as Esther had ordered. So again, the implication with fasting is that they were fasting and praying, even though it doesn't say it here. But she and her, the women that serve her, and all the Jews, the word gets out, pray, fast for 3 days. And she's going to go talk to the king on our behalf. And she's resolved to, and if I perish, I perish. There was a time to be silent earlier. Now she knows it's time to speak up. It's time to say who she is. Do you believe that God has a purpose for you? Does he have a purpose for your life? Do you believe that every action or event that occurs in your life has a reality and a reason that it happens? What we see in this book are a series of things that the world would call coincidences, but we see the hand of God moving things into place. Did Esther have a choice? She could have said no. Does God need Esther? No. Does God need me? No. He could use someone else to teach this class, but he has given me the opportunity to be a part of his work. He gave Esther the opportunity to be a part of something so big that would save so many people. And so she is going to submit to God. and be used by God. What is your purpose in life for this point in your life? Maybe it was something when you were earlier, and maybe now you're transitioning, and God's not finished with you. You're still breathing, every one of you. You're still breathing. All you people online, you're still breathing. You have a reason to be here, and God has a purpose and a plan for you. You may not become a royalty. I'm sorry. That's not in it for everybody. But He has an important plan for your life. What you do, what you say can affect your family. Maybe not your entire race like Esther, but what you do has a profound effect on your immediate family, on the people you're around the most, and on the people that God brings into your life. So think about that this week. We're going to continue Esther's story next week to see how this all plays out, how God works everything out for their good and His glory. It's a powerful, powerful story. Let's pray. Oh, Lord God, thank you that you love us and you care about every detail of our lives. Thank you that you give us opportunities to serve you. May we be passionate about how we serve you. Lord, equip us through your word. Teach us through prayer. Guide us through fellowship with other believers. Help us to always be seeking you, your will, and your purpose. Go with us now as we go into a world that does not look at us favorably as Christians in a favorable way. But Lord, we know that the time is not now to be silent, but the time is to speak the truth in love. In Jesus' name, amen.